What if I told you that the latest entry in the Doom franchise, Doom the Dark Ages, has more in common with a turn-based role-playing game than it does with any other member of its franchise? You'd probably look at me like I was crazy. Doom is a fast-paced shooter, how could it possibly be anything like an RPG? And then you'd probably say, haha, very funny, you mean the mobile-exclusive Doom role-playing game from way back in 2005. And I'd say, what, that existed? Holy crap, it does. Anyway, no, I don't mean that. I mean an actual real video game that came out this year. Let me explain. So, as I was playing through Doom the Dark Ages, which is mostly very enjoyable, save for the turret and mech sections, which are rubbish, one thing kept bothering me. I was having loads of fun, but even though I was playing on max difficulty, I was finding it a bit easy, and it felt like I picked up the nuances of the game's new central shield mechanics a little bit quicker than I was supposed to, and I was parrying my way through what was supposed to be some pretty hard fights without really breaking much of a sweat. So, powered by some unearned self-confidence, I decided to go back and try playing Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, also on Nightmare, to see if I really had magically gotten better at the series, only to get my face pounded into the dirt by the imps in the first few arenas over and over again. This was, as you might imagine, confusing. These games are basically all the same. They've all got cacodemons and super shotguns and this guy, but for some reason, my skills just weren't translating. And it felt like I wasn't just bad at Eternal in 2016, it was that my techniques and reflexes from Dark Ages were actively getting me killed. Now, this will be perfectly understandable if everyone was saying that Dark Ages was easier than the other Doom games, but they aren't. In fact, not only are opinions on what the hardest Doom game is seemingly pretty mixed, but people can't even seem to agree on which ones of these three games are even worth playing at all. And it wasn't until I rage quit the Doom franchise entirely to have a go with the other game I was playing at the time, the fantastic RPG Clair Obscur Expedition 33, that everything finally clicked into place. See, Clair Obscur, much like Doom Dark Ages, also has a heavy emphasis on timing and reaction speed based gameplay, to the point that successfully parrying and dodging enemy attacks is the primary criteria for success in both games. And as a result, and while I didn't realise it at the time, playing through Clair Obscur actually ended up training me to be good at Dark Ages, because while they share very little on a visual, thematic, or even genre level, they both require the same frame of mind and fundamentally test the same sorts of pattern matching and quick reacting skills. That's all in stark contrast to the psychological lurches I would have to make to reconfigure my brain in order to handle the meth-fueled tactics of Doom Eternal and the high-pressure resource management of Doom 2016, both of which appear to share a lot on a mechanical level, but as anyone who's trying to switch between those games can attest, require totally different frames of mind. Essentially, while Doom the Dark Ages and Clair Obscur may appear to differ completely, on a psychological and skill testing level, they have a whole bunch in common, and their shared focus on a particular kind of difficulty, namely the precision associated with so-called parry slop gameplay, gives them an incredibly powerful, yet kind of invisible gameplay link that transcends the way we normally classify games. I don't know about you, but I find that absolutely fascinating, and it brings me onto what I actually want to talk about today, and that is difficulty. Specifically, I want to talk about the idea that difficulty isn't this single measurement by which all games are judged, nor an immutable and objective quality, but instead something that comes in a whole bunch of different flavours and is something that we have a much more complex relationship with than we ever tend to consider. Think about it, right? 9 times out of 10, when we talk about a game's difficulty, we tend to subconsciously place all games on the same linear objective scale from the hardest possible game to the easiest possible game. Counter-Strike? That's a hard game. Pokemon? That's an easy game. Isles of Sea and Sky? Yeah, that's reasonably hard, whereas Portal? That's reasonably easy. Hello Kitty Island Adventure? Obviously for hardcore gamers only. League of Legends? Well, that's only a few steps up from being a colouring book, so into the easy end of the scale it goes. But while this approach to difficulty might feel intuitive, it really isn't a useful way of approaching the topic. Not only is everyone going to engage with the same game's difficulty in different ways, because we all have different skill sets and levels of ability, but directly comparing games on a basis of universal difficulty is similarly flawed, because they're often not even trying to be difficult in the same way. Just because someone is good at the fast reaction speeds and attention to detail required to AWP down mid in Counter-Strike, in no way means that they'll find the big picture strategy and planning required to be good at competitive Pokemon just as easy. Isles of Sea and Sky and Portal might both be ostensibly puzzle games, but just from playing them you can instantly tell that the lateral thinking required to succeed at Portal won't serve you well at all when it comes to the more cerebral demands of a soccer band game, and even our perception of difficulty itself is subjective. A League of Legends player might think that their tactical decision making couldn't possibly get any more challenging, that is until they play this puzzle in Hello Kitty and their brains explode from the sheer complexity. Jokes aside, I do think the way that we as a community talk about difficulty often misses the forest for the trees a little bit. We don't really ever consider it, but difficulty as a concept is kind of fundamental to video games as a medium. And by that I don't mean some bullshit about only hard games being real video games. I mean that the way games as interactive art convey their interactive nature is through difficulty. Without some form of resistance to our actions, something for our brains to push against, not only would our choices and effort not mean anything, but there will be nothing for them to affect, and therefore nothing to demonstrate that we did anything at all. Everything from the simplest dating sim to the most intricate strategy game is constantly resisting us, demanding that we make choices or figure stuff out or demonstrate our skills, and it's in working against this resistance by interacting with and manipulating the mechanics that the video game itself starts happening. And by changing the kind of difficulty games use to challenge us and which mental muscles we're asked to use to push back against them, games can dramatically change how they feel to play, often without actually altering any of their surface level qualities. Basically, to TLDR the vague stuff I just said, difficulty isn't just a game design, it's inherent to what games are, and by reducing it to just a measure of how challenging a particular Night Rain boss fight is, we blind ourselves to a totally different lens through which to view games. And that's why what I want to do is to break down what I think 6 fundamental types of difficulty are, so I can showcase how different approaches to this core facet of video games can change how we interact with them in ways that transcend our usual mechanically focused understanding of genre. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list, and I fully encourage you to tell me about all the things I missed in the comments, but I reckon I can boil down all the different types of difficulty into these 6 archetypes: precision, problem solving, navigation, computation, logistics, and comprehension, each one representing a different approach to difficulty the games use to get us thinking in different ways. And before you ask, no, I haven't recently read the back catalogue of Marc LeBlanc, creator of the 8 Types of Fun framework, and quite frankly I have no idea what either of those two things are. Let's never speak of it again. Anyway, the first kind of difficulty I want to talk about is in many ways the most simple, and that is precision. The challenge inherent in doing something accurately, within a specific time frame, or within a small area. Whether it's quickly snapping around to nail a headshot in a shooter, or expertly dodge rolling through a stupidly long chain of attacks, or nailing precise jump timings in a platformer, the fun of precision-based difficulty is almost physical in nature, with it being all about pushing your hand-eye coordination and sense of timing to their limits, with very little in the way of conscious decision-making to get in the way. This is why games with precision-based difficulty are often so closely associated with that ultra-satisfying flow state, where you're so intently focused on keeping to the beat in Hi-Fi Rush or playing green attack tennis in Doom the Dark Ages that you're operating purely on instinct, creating a sense of challenge that's much more visceral than other, more cerebral forms of resistance that require more conscious thought than the bare minimum required to avoid spiky death. That's of course not to say that all precision-based difficulty games are by nature intense and exhausting. The fun of many work simulator games, that being the engrossing rhythm of performing fairly rote but mechanically demanding tasks, is just as valid a form of precision-based difficulty, and as a result, popping zombie heads in Resident Evil and dismantling spaceships in Hardspray Shipbreaker weirdly have the same kind of precision-based, flow-statey appeal, albeit at different levels of intensity. Relatedly, navigation-based difficulty also draws from a more physical, subconscious set of skills. We don't really think about it, but conceptualizing space in games, whether that's flying around on a vehicle or just running and jumping about, requires, to use a scientific term, a metric fuckload of mental work, estimating speed, making micro-adjustments to your trajectory, and scanning for obstacles. And this intuitive nature is not only why stuff like platformers and racing games are so easy to get to grips with, it's also why traversal as a form of difficulty has so much more longevity than other kinds. Getting from A to B in Astrobot, or zooming around the world in Mario Kart for example, is much more of an exercise in spatial reasoning and being able to visualize your route through the environment than it is about individual timings or specific inputs. And as a result, navigation-based games often feature high degrees of granularity, because it's the nuances of movement and your relationship with the environment that makes getting around fun to figure out, and also means that there's almost always some new optimization to make in your route or some new subtlety to master. And it's no surprise why speedrunning is so at home in games that prioritize simple but expressive mechanics as their primary forms of interaction. No other kind of difficulty offers such a canvas for constant improvement. Even in games with less expressive movement, the challenge of understanding your relationship with the digital space, knowing what paths are open and where you need to go next to reach an objective, can still be found. Oftentimes, the fundamental difficulty of a Metroidvania or an open world game comes more from your ability to master the map itself and figure out more efficient ways to move around than anything you'd actually find within the world or the combat, which, particularly in the case of Metroidvanias, exists more and more as a sort of vestigial element that most developers just sort of include by default. On the other end of the cognitive spectrum, we have logistical difficulty, which is all about big picture, long-term work. In most games that focus on requiring planning and organization as their primary form of resistance against the player, very little is actually happening from moment to moment, and the impacts of your decisions sometimes won't be felt for hours after the fact. And that's fine, because it's your ability to plan and extrapolate that's being put under pressure. In a city builder or a factory game, most of the actual gameplay is just the busy work of implementing plans and designs that you've already come up with, because all the actual work is happening in your head, not your hands. As a result, the fun of logistical difficulty is often kind of front-loaded, and you can't rely on a steady drip feed of satisfying challenge, because once you've solved the big overarching puzzle of your path to victory, then there's not much else for your brain to do. That's why the best logistical games are constantly adding new elements to the equation, forcing you to reconsider and re-solve your strategic analysis as new options and complications come into view. This is why games of Civilization or other 4X games often get boring towards the endgame. You've already solved the logistical problem of how to win, and actually doing it isn't very challenging anymore. That's why stuff like Paradox games love shaking things up by murdering your character or filling the galaxy with space monsters every now and again to give you a whole new set of logistical challenges to tackle. In a linked but I think necessarily separate category, I'd put problem solving, which is less about strategic planning and more about improvisation and creativity. If the deck construction part of a deck builder is logistically difficult, then the actual matches are all about tactical problem solving, and this form of difficulty essentially tests our ability to manipulate rules and systems. There's no way of planning in advance how you're going to clear out a ship of pirates in the excellent immersive sim Skin Deep, but that's fine, because the game doesn't really want you to. Instead, it's all about throwing a bunch of problems your way and handing you a bunch of tools, and then asking you to get the job done in any way you can. And basically all problem-solving centric games are an extension of this dynamic. They're tests of understanding, more so than anything else. The challenge in, say, Tears of the Kingdom isn't whether you can get over this big gap or navigate this obstacle course, it's whether you're able to figure out how to do it by combining your knowledge with the tools you have available. And it's the great rush of understanding you get from finding out a cool new way to do something that defines problem-solving based games. Whether it's a new factory layout in Factorio, a new Rube Goldberg murder machine in Hitman, or an insane synergy in Monster Train, it always serves as proof that you've cracked the code and made a leap of understanding through nothing but your own imagination. The inverse of problem solving is computation, which rather than focusing on understanding and creativity is all about linearly applied brain power. Many old school puzzle games, a lot of board games with high information fidelity like chess, and also a lot of strategy games like Into the Breach all draw their primary source of difficulty from our ability to, in effect, process data. Basically, if it's the sort of game a computer would be able to trivially solve, it's probably computationally difficult. But the thing that makes stuff like Soccer Bands, Solitaire, and Splendor so compelling is precisely this level of uncompromising logical complexity. You simply can't cheat your way around or imagine your own way through a computational problem. You just have to knuckle down and solve it. And this makes finally analysing all the different permutations of a level in the Talos Principle, or solving your way through a massive Minesweeper board in Demon Crawl incredibly satisfying, because it's a pure expression of your mental power. Of course, linearly increasing the complexity isn't the only way to modulate computational difficulty. Adding stuff like time pressure that you'd find in stuff like the oppressive resource management game Anoxia Station, or elements of chance like in many strategy games, add nuances and interesting wrinkles to games to prevent them from becoming just highly abstracted forms of data entry. And finally, we've got comprehension-based difficulty, which is less about doing work towards the answer and more about trying to figure out what the question is. In, say, Outer Wilds, the main source of difficulty doesn't come from successfully navigating around or mastering the controls of your spaceship, though admittedly they are pretty fiddly. It comes from figuring out how the hell this big crazy solar system works and deciphering all the clues the game gives you until it finally makes sense. Games that hinge on comprehension are all about lateral thinking and observation skills, of approaching new ideas from different angles until you find the one that fits. In a comprehension-centric puzzle game like, say, Viewfinder, none of the puzzles are actually particularly challenging from a solving them perspective, and that's because all the challenge comes from figuring out some new interpretation of the rules or a change in perspective required for the solution to magically slide into focus. And this is true for a whole bunch of games that rely on this kind of difficulty. Discovery games, point and clicks, and even the basic old hidden object games your mum plays are all about that great eureka moment of seeing something you couldn't before. And if you want to get really fancy, you could even argue that the fundamental locus of difficulty driving narrative games is also comprehension. Even though they're never actually that challenging, making the right choice in a visual novel or a branching path game, even if it's just the choice you think will be best for your own narrative progression, requires understanding the ideas the game is presenting from multiple points of view. And it's this element of narrative decoding and interpretation that separates a video game story from a typical linear narrative where everything is delivered to you, just like how difficulty as a concept is the hidden engine that makes video games work. While my janky 6-type system might very well be rubbish and full of holes, I think the fundamental change in perspective that is seeing video game difficulty not as a mere descriptor of how hard we need to work to beat a game, but as the thing that determines how we interact with games at all, is the gateway to a huge number of weird things about games suddenly making sense. For example, look at how there seems to be two entirely separate genres, both occupying the label of puzzle games. On one hand, you've got the more traditional kind of puzzlers like Bejeweled or Soccer Bands or programming challenges like a Zachtronics title, and on the other side you've got stuff like Myst or Portal or Cocoon that are more focused on big, splashy eureka moments. And it's rare to find someone who likes both kinds of games equally, in spite of the fact that both are only ever referred to as puzzle games. The distinction, and the reason why people prefer one kind or another, becomes way clearer though when you consider that they are different interpretations of the puzzle game structure oriented around different kinds of difficulty. You'll never beat Chance of Sennar using only brute force process of elimination. You've got to apply a little bit of lateral thinking to decode all the clever ways that information is being hidden, and equally you will hit a brick wall in Can of Wormholes if you're not willing to sit down and actually figure it out instead of looking for a sneaky workaround. This is a dichotomy that gets especially weird when you consider stuff like Baba Is You and Void Stranger, two games that appear to be straightforward computationally oriented soccer bands that actually turn out to require a hell of a lot of imagination to progress through. And on the flip side, you've got the Talos Principle, which initially appears to be more in the vein of Portal, but is actually about hard-as-nails logic puzzles and isn't very comprehension focused at all. It's weird. A similar mystery can be explained when we look at why first-person platformers didn't arise until more than a decade after developers figured out 3D movement. It's because a first-person perspective didn't offer existing platformer developers anything new other than it being way harder to see what was happening in the level, so they never really found a niche. But for DICE, veteran first-person shooter developers of Battlefield, a shift into prioritizing navigational difficulty, which had always been a small but important part of FPS design, presented an interesting way to turn the limitations of the genre into strengths. Suddenly, a limited field of view forced you to visualize the level in your head, and an emphasis on ranged enemies over Goombas and spikes encouraged thinking in terms of creative level traversal to stay out of line of sight and find clever attack routes, giving us Mirror's Edge, and soon after a whole micro-genre of navigation-centric first-person games like Titanfall, Ghost Runner, and Neon White, all of which could never have been made by simply adapting existing platformer dynamics and could only have arisen by using difficulty as a means of interrogating the FPS from a new direction, to explore its mechanical potential from a new point of view. Difficulty type is something that gets even more important to think about when you consider that many games often use multiple sources of difficulty at once, leveraging the idiosyncrasies of one style against another to create much more nuanced experiences and to fix long-standing problems in interesting ways. Look at Clair Obscur, which I mentioned earlier. It's part of a long tradition of turn-based RPGs which bring in some precision-based difficulty in order to make their core battling mechanics more interesting. A large problem with many turn-based games that make heavy use of problem-solving in their battles is that often the problem isn't very interesting to solve. Have you ever played Pokémon and known that all you need to do is just spam one super effective move over and over to win? Or even worse, played a JRPG and figured out that you can win a battle by just mindlessly mashing basic attack? Yeah, it sucks because you already know exactly what you're going to do before the battle even starts. So, what adding in stuff like timed attacks to do bonus damage, or the ability to dodge or parry enemy move does, is not just keep you occupied during some brutally long animations, but also add some sorely needed entropy into these considerations. Suddenly, you don't know how much damage the enemy is going to have next turn, because you don't know for sure whether you can hit the timing on this big combo move, and you don't know how much health you'll have either, because who knows if you can dodge the enemy counterattack. Both variables forcing you to consider new options and new strategic perspectives from turn to turn. And, rather than just being a given, the ability to accurately predict the flow of the battle is now a reward locked behind beating the various precision challenges, keeping the game feeling fresh for much longer. The same sort of logic applies to the design of battle royales. The ever-shrinking ring around a randomly selected point on the map adds an additional layer of navigational strategy to your gameplay, with you not just needing to win gunfights, but also plan your route across the map to hoover up as much loot as possible and secure an advantageous position when it comes time for the final showdown. And on the other side of the coin, I love tactics and colony building games like Fire Emblem, RimWorld, and you know that one, the one with the soldiers and the aliens. I don't know, I don't play that game very much, because they zoom out and use long-term logistical thinking to enrich their smaller scale engagements. Some random battle against a bunch of enemy goons would barely register as important if there was nothing on the line, but when my special sniper boy and the success of the resistance cell I've been cultivating are under threat, suddenly every move matters and my tactical choices end up warping around my macro level concerns. I guess the thing about this topic that I find so interesting is that difficulty as the type of interaction we have with games is sort of this extra level of understanding that's always existed within the medium, but we've never really interrogated, and it's proof that the language of games criticism and the way we talk about games in general is still kind of in its infancy. Genre as we use it in gaming circles is the only means by which we have to categorize games, but because all we can really do right now is copy other mediums, we end up only ever viewing games from a surface level perspective, concerned more with their presentation style and structure than how they actually play. And I think if nothing else, that makes recommending and talking about why we did or did not like particular games really hard. I mean, look at the issues I had with the Doom trilogy back at the start of the video. It would be inaccurate to describe all three games as anything other than first-person shooters, but that description does nothing to explain how different they all are to play on a practical level. Someone who loved Doom 2016 for the way you have to carefully manage your health and the ammo on your power weapons might absolutely hate the hyperactive rock paper scissors gameplay of Doom Eternal, fans of which would probably have much more fun with something like Ultra Kill than they would with Dark Ages, which, particularly when it comes to the boss fights, plays more like Sekiro than it does a classic shooter. And while that's fine, and while I love the way that id has experimented with the formula, it kind of feels like we as a community lack the language right now to talk about games in this way. Look at how hard it is to recommend games. Knowing what kind of thought processes a game requires and what kind of skills it tests is, if anything, more important than what individual mechanics a game contains or what its theme is, and yet we simply don't have the linguistic or design tools necessary to easily distinguish them. As a great example, take these two very similar but also very different games, Wordplay and the on-the-nose named Wordatro. They both have the same central gimmick of Balatro but with Scrabble mechanics, but each one emphasizes a very different kind of difficulty, leading to games that appeal to different people. Wordatro's crazy powerful special tiles and passive effects reward thinking about the game in terms of problem solving, stacking together compounding effects to pull off mega combos, whereas Wordplay's comparatively muted effects and its much less forgiving shuffling system forces you to actually get good at word games and spend time optimizing your moves and really thinking about every word, meaning that these two conceptually identical games will appeal to very different people. And this is a pattern that repeats across video games and has been since the days of Sonic and Mario both being platformers, but both feeling very different to play. So if you're gonna take anything from this long, rambling video about difficulty, what it means, and what we're gonna do with it, you should take away the fact that looking at games from the top down isn't the only way we should be analysing them, and it's often just as important to be considering how they feel to play from the bottom up as well. Theme, individual mechanics, and even how hard a game is, which yes is distinct from difficulty, I meant what I said about that language being bad, okay, are ultimately secondary to how we interact with the game on a fundamental level, and that's often the thing that we can only ever really work out through play, and by consciously analysing not just what we're doing in a game, but how we're doing it, and what ways we need to think about it in order to progress. Which is to say, when we're playing something new, it's always worthwhile to keep an open mind and always be asking ourselves not just what game we're playing, but how we're supposed to be playing it. Are you expected to be finding clever solutions to open-ended problems, or is the game trying to test your brainpower? Is the game more about looking straight ahead and reacting to what's coming, or is it more about finding your own way to the finish? And if you're ever playing a game where you find that you're not having to think at all, and that you're bored out of your fucking mind, then you might just be playing one of Doom the Dark Ages' stupid minigames where you literally just hold the fire button down until something dies. Seriously, who thought this was a good idea? It's genuinely insane how aggressively terrible these sections are. How do you take something as cool as a robot dragon and make it unfathomably lame? I mean, it's just ridiculous. Look, I'm doing nothing. There's no gameplay happening here. What the hell? Hello everyone and welcome back to this, the After the Video segment. Wow, it turns out trying to write two videos at the same time is a mistake. Who'd have guessed? Anyway, this is the part of each and every video where I tell you all about some really cool people, some of whom you may not have heard of, and some of whom you probably have by now. So, first up, and this is a bit of a weird recommendation, but it is for Mark Rosewater, current head designer of Magic the Gathering, and his series of Making Magic articles that he's been posting on the internet for like 3 decades now. It is truly impossible to overstate just how much of a bottomless wellspring of really interesting design insights Mark Rosewater is, and there is a really unique perspective that can only come from someone who's been helping to make an incredibly complex game since before I was born. And Mark goes into some great detail about why all of Magic's best ideas and fan favourite sets work so well, whilst also being incredibly candid about all the stuff he's done that hasn't worked and, quite frankly, was terrible. Even if you've never played Magic, I still think Mark's articles have a load of great lessons in them. In particular, his stuff about the colour pie and the 3-player psychographics are pretty universal sources of design wisdom, so please do give them a look. Of course, Mark Rosewater pales in comparison to the real heroes of this channel, and those are my wonderful supporters. It is they and they alone who ensure that I get to make stupid videos about stuff that doesn't even matter, like this one. Yeah, sure, I could be pumping out rage bait slop about how video games are dead, and the exact peak of the medium just so happened to be when I and I alone was 12 years old, but some of us have got standards, and it is incredibly heartwarming to see people support content like this that takes a little bit of time, sometimes longer than I'd like, to get right. And if you'd like to join those people in supporting the channel, then in return you'll get exclusive early access to videos, behind the scenes bonus content, extra update videos, my eternal respect, and of course, your name in the credits. As you can see here, wow, look at all those handsome people, look at them go, whoa. And also, if you donate on my top tier Patreon level, which for the first time in like a year has an open slot now I think, you'll even get a voiced shout out alongside these fine people, who are Ali Wright, Andrew Labrano, Auno94, Bobby, Brian Natariani, Constantine Amend, Cosmix360, Daniel Medjes, Dirk Jan Karambeld, Digleteer, Dis Ellie, Ecton, Edward Franklin Woods, Edwina the Space Bun, Eric Woolston, Eugene Bulkin, Fullabaxi, Furious Hulk, Gazkull, How, Heck It's Noah, Jacob Dylan Riddle, Jinkaloid, Kevin Help Us, Conlove, Kangi, Luke Kokoran, Mace Window 54, Maxim Filipov, Mark Vallant, May Contain Fox-Like Substance, Mika Oi, Michael C., Mike Oxlong, Nate Graff, Oliver Marhofer, Patrick Romberg, Peter Tomasic, Probably Contains Fox-Like Substance, Reddedex, Regal Regex, Seslux, Silver Fofi, Tyler Duncan, Timothy Spexek, Whimsical Wisp, Zach Brantmeyer, and ciao. Okay, that's it from me. Bye!